Psychology Month happens in February every year, and this year the theme we chose was Women in Science. I did 4 podcasts here on this platform and 4 written profiles that we put on the website of the Canadian Psychological Association. Now, this is the best part of my job, getting to speak with interesting people about interesting subjects, and so I thought it was a good idea to extend Psychology Month a little by bringing you some of the conversations that didn't get on the podcast in February, starting with Dr. Liisa Galea from the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the Communications Specialist at the CPA, and this is Mindful. We are hearing a lot of late about men's mental health care, how we hope to convince men to be more open to speaking about mental health issues, and how too often they're conditioned to stay quiet on the subject. And this is a real problem. But it remains women who face the biggest challenges when accessing mental health care and whose issues have the biggest discrepancy when it comes to mental health research funding. My guest today works with a group called womenmind, an initiative of the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health aimed at addressing those gaps and promoting the work of women, transgender and non-binary scientists in this space.
Hello, my name is Liisa Galea, and I am the Tray Living Family Chair in Women's Mental Health, a senior scientist at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health here in Toronto, Canada. And I'm also a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto.
You are involved with womenmind in a big way. This is the CAMH program. Can you tell me what CAMH stands for? Because I have forgotten the acronym already.
So the CAMH stands for the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And womenmind, I was recruited from University of British Columbia, so I was there for 25 years as a professor of psychology, actually there. And, it takes a lot to move from, I don't know if anybody's visited Vancouver, but it's a very beautiful city. It does rain a lot. There's some mountains and some oceans. And now I've gone to the concrete jungle. There's no mountains or oceans. The reason I went was because CAMH put a program in place called womenmind, and there are 3 objectives of womenmind. The first is to raise awareness of the gender gap in terms of mental health. The second is to promote women plus, I like to say women plus scientists. So it's regardless of your sex at birth, anyone that identifies as a woman or gender diverse individual. So promoting women scientists in general at CAMH, and also to increase advanced research in women's mental health research as well.
So talk to me about the gender gap in mental health, right? Yeah. We hear a lot about, we haven't really focused on men's mental health, and we really need to convince men to be more open about talking about it. Yeah. But what is the gender gap in the outcomes of mental health here in Canada?
So I'll say that I'm just going to start from further out even. We know that there is a delay in diagnosis in over 1,300 different disorders, not just mental health, of 2 years or more in terms of women being diagnosed later than men. And if you just look at mental health disorders, this is actually from a Danish study, but the same numbers show up in Canada as well. If you just look at mental health disorders, despite the fact that we have this idea that men and males don't talk about their feelings as much, don't seek the mental health help, we still have a delay in diagnosis of over 2 years. And of course, that delay in diagnosis can interfere with our treatment plans, right? If you're being misdiagnosed or you're being dismissed with your symptoms, you're not getting the treatment you need. And we already know that early treatment involves the best outcome. So this has significant repercussions for women's health just in general. There was another very large study done by the World Economic Forum that showed that women spend 25% more of their time, of their lives, in poor health than men do. So again, that's just overall. In terms of mental health specifically, again, we see those same kinds of delays. And the thing I was going to say is that there's going to be many reasons for these delays in diagnosis. But one of the major reasons I think happens is because most of our medical knowledge, including the symptoms on our checklist for diagnoses, are based on males or the experiences of men. So much so that we call symptoms, particularly for mental health disorders in females, as atypical. So you'll see this atypical label, and you've probably heard about it in terms of just sort of a neurodiverse development, like autism,
Right.
ADHD. You've probably heard of, but we also hear it, and there are more males that are diagnosed with that. Those conditions than females. More females are diagnosed with depression than males, but we also see that atypical label in depression for
Right.
females. So like if you think about it, that just doesn't make any sense. We also have it for PTSD,
Yeah.
post-traumatic stress disorder, as well. So when you start thinking about this, if two-thirds, so it's not like there's two times more women or females diagnosed with depression than men. But if there's twice as many women being diagnosed with depression than men, how do they have atypical symptoms? Right. And so that
Right.
those just like
Yeah.
it boggles mind a little bit. And I think the other thing about it is, and I think it's because our scales are developed with thinking about men. I mean, they were just developed a long time ago, and there are many types of scales. We can talk about that too. But we have to also realize that words have consequences. And so they have consequences not just for the person that's experiencing them, like to them, it's not atypical, this is what I'm feeling, but it has consequences for our healthcare providers. They don't get enough knowledge about some of these sex and gender disparities in disease presentation or disordered presentation. But they also have consequences for our politicians
Right.
and our funding bodies. So I can tell you, as a researcher that's been in this field for 28 years, I get a lot of comments from editors and from funding agencies that like, well, this isn't really an important thing to study because it's only in a subset of the population.
Right. Well, and that's something I wanted to ask about too. One of the things that I first heard about that drew me to Women Mind in the first place was this idea of how incredibly small the percentage of research studies that
Mhm.
focus specifically on women are. And I
Yeah.
was wondering if what is the reason for that? Is it because most mental health studies are trying to include everybody? Are they men and women equally?
Mhm.
Is it,
Mhm.
non-binary people
Mhm.
included as well? We've
Mhm.
done
Mhm.
quite a few
Mhm.
podcasts here on cis normativity and
Yeah.
healthcare in general
Yeah.
and how that
Yes.
affects people who are trans and
Yes.
non-binary.
Yeah, I know.
And including them in research is very difficult too for a lot of
Yes.
researchers because you're adding a third category and now you have to focus on that. But why are women so underrepresented, or specifically, the study of women's issues so underrepresented in mental health research?
Let's just give some context. So we actually did a deep dive into the literature. It's published, where we looked at what the percentage of studies were, and this is what you were alluding to. And even though 68% of this, and we only looked at male, female, like gender was hardly mentioned. And this is in neuroscience and psychiatry, so not just mental health. Neuroscience just meaning the study of the brain. And it was 68% of the studies were using or said that used both males and females, but only 5% of the studies actually looked to see whether that made a difference. So what I mean by that is you can have, say, and we saw some studies like this, like 2 females and 8 males in your control group, but you have the reverse in your treatment group, like 2 males and 8 females. And so it's such an unbalance of the percentage of males versus females. You can't do the analysis properly, right? Because you just don't have the sample size to look to see if that actually made a difference. But often people would lump everybody together and just say, "Oh,
Right.
did it make a difference or not?" So 5%. So that's a very small percentage. And then we also look to see, well, how many are centered just solely in males, solely in females? And there were 27% of the studies solely in males. This is from 2019, and 3% in females. And we looked in 2009 too, and it used to be 4% in females and went down to 3%. We also looked at Canadian grants, and it's very, very similar percentages. And grants are just where we get our money when we're, health researchers. And we recently looked at 2023 because some people have been saying, "Oh, well, that was such a long time ago. It's improving," and no. And in fact, mental health specifically for women was 1%. 1% of the funding of Canadian Institutes for Health Research was going towards asking questions about women's mental health. It's a very small number of
Yeah,
grants.
that's a shockingly small number.
It's a shockingly small number. And we're doing it historically because we get all sorts of criticism about these kinds of analyses, as well as that. And I can tell you that the numbers are not changing at all last time, it was really interesting. So back in 1993, the NIH, which is in the US, National Institutes for Health,
Yeah.
they mandated that for clinical trials, you had to include women and minorities, people of color and minorities. And while the number of trials or the percentage of trials have increased, they're still not analyzing to look to see if does that make a difference or not. And that's the crux of it. It's sort of like that old Seinfeld episode, which probably no one will know except if you're a certain age. But it's easy to take your reservation. You have a whole
Yeah. Yes.
to include,
I am of a certain
episode.
age.
Yeah, it's easy to include like them, non-binary, gender diverse. But if you don't look to see, is that affecting your outcomes or outcomes for those individuals, we're never going to be able to tell. Or Black individuals, for example, or Indigenous individuals, for example. We still have to look to see how are those. It's important enough to gather all those people, but it's another thing to actually do the statistical analysis on them. And that's sort of what we're talking about. And the other point I'd make is looking across sex, sex differences, or looking across genders, men, women, gender diverse, trans, that's important. But we also really need to do deep dives within sex and within gender. So, not all trans individuals are the same
Right.
trans individual. And actually, it means different things to different people.
Mm-hmm.
And that heterogeneity, I can't think of another word other than heterogeneity, but that sort of variety is really important. That's what makes us all individuals. And that to me and that's the same thing with women in general too. Some of us have been pregnant. Some of us had infertility treatments. Some of us had normal, quote unquote, natural, 28-day menstrual cycles. Some of us had 35-day menstrual cycles. Some of us took hormonal contraceptives. Some of us didn't. There are different kinds of menopauses. That beautiful diversity is important to study because we already know that these things can influence our health outcomes and disease risk, but they're very rarely studied. And you might have heard of the term personalized medicine or precision medicine. You heard those terms?
I have heard the term, yes. I don't know exactly what it entails.
So it just means that the treatment's going to be tailored to the individual. And what often people will think of it as your genotype, right? You get your DNA and you have these specific genetic markers that might say, oh, you have a greater risk for Alzheimer's disease, for example, or Parkinson's disease, for example, or breast cancer. And so if you have this increased risk, here are some things that you can do to mitigate against that risk. So people will often think about genotype, often think about genetics, but also our hormonal experiences, including, stress and trauma, which are also hormonal experiences, can also influence our, not just our disease risk and our health outcomes, but likely treatment as well. And that's just so understudied. It's hard to come up with some really good examples around it, but I probably could have pushed.
Yeah. Well, and I know womenmind is pushing toward greater inclusivity and certainly in terms of the science, but also in terms of the people who are doing the science.
Yes. Yeah.
How much of a difference can that make? If there are more women and girls getting into STEM fields, if there are more women who are doing the research at the academic university level, will that make a difference in the type of studies that are happening, or is the funding envelope the big barrier to it?
I think it's both. So we need measures. I'm going to say tax, but we need measures on both sides of the coin. So it's interesting to me if the data bear this out that like girls are very interested in science and in all scientific fields, actually at a pretty early age. But as time goes on, as we get further and further in our career, you start to see this disparity grow. So it starts to happen, I think that it's now at sort of the university level. You see more girls and women in STEM fields in university. There's, of course, a little bit of disparity between the disciplines, of course, but in graduate school, it gets a bit wider. Doing these academic positions like assistant professor, so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Even physicians are more. I believe there's more women physicians than there are male physicians. But then at like sort of the dean level and chief physician levels, you don't see as many women in those positions.
Right.
So
It's similar in psychology, I think, where we see there are more women who are practitioners of psychology, but fewer at the academic level in university institutions. And, and we also track as best we can, and we don't have a lot of data, but, minority students who are Black or Indigenous and who are going through.
Worse. It's always worse, right?
It's always worse the higher up you go. Yeah.
Yeah. And I usually, when I give a talk, I talk about, hey, the gender and sex disparities I'm going to be talking about are manyfold worse in people of color, Indigenous, trans, and gender diverse individuals. It's almost like we're the sex and gender stuff is like the canary in the coal mine. We're like, hey, there's a problem here. And why is it a problem? So why is it important is what you asked about. It's not one-to-one. Like not all women will study women's health issues. We're a pretty small percentage of the academic population that studies it anyway. And I think some really interesting reasons for that. But when we do, when there are people, this is why diversity in science is so important, because if you're always chasing sort of one theory and then you miss something else entirely. So a big one in the Alzheimer's field there's been a big chase of the amyloid hypothesis. There's two neuropathological features of Alzheimer's disease, amyloid and tau. And now, in fact, they're finding amyloid doesn't seem to be doing the things that they really think it's doing. It might be tau that we should have been going after, and that's why we need the people that do tau to be out there too. Right. We can't just put all of our eggs in one basket. Right? We don't know where the next great discovery is going to come from. It could come from studying microbes in Yosemite National Park. People that did that, I think it was somebody with the last name of Frost, and there was some other last name, but I can't recall. Anyway, that led to the tools that we need to look at our genes.
Yeah.
So, who would know that that's where that would come from?
What? I was just talking about that yesterday because I don't know, somebody somewhere, I think it was Scientific American, published a story about Ozempic and what led to the creation of Ozempic. And it was someone studying the venom of Gila monsters 30 years ago in the 80s.
Yeah. I retweeted that one. Yeah. It was so interesting, right?
And I dug up an article from, I think it was Esquire magazine that was in 1984 listed the dumbest scientific studies of the year. Here's the stupid things that we're wasting money on science, and Gila monster venom. What a bunch of dummies. Look at what happened. And I don't think it's because most, the layperson doesn't really understand a scientific article. You can only read the headline, and you want to make some sort of immediate judgment and joke about it, and then you don't understand any of, and even the person who research may not understand the future ramifications of it, right?
No, and it's the long game. Science is a long game, right? Most of us are just trying to find a piece of the puzzle that we know will influence science later on. And there was a really nice article, I think it's in the Boston Globe, but it was a few years ago now, but I think it's called Let's Waste More Money on Science.
Yeah.
And the idea is we need these diverse minds to think about all of these things like Gila monsters. I think that's Daniel Drucker. He's Canadian, or he's at least in Toronto, that made the big discoveries in GLP-1 and Ozempic. So I'll give you two examples, success stories fairly recently. One is, and I'm very sorry, I've forgotten the person's name, but they're in the US. They're in California. Thank you. And so I'm so mad that I'm forgetting it. She experienced nausea and vomiting during pregnancy. So she was in some kind of genetics lab. And so she came back after a horrific experience and said, I'm going to study this, because she was just told, just as I suffered from it too, that it was just like, oh, it's just your nerves. Like if I admit you to hospital, I was told, if I admit you to hospital, it'll go away. And I was like, I don't think so.
Right.
Anyway, I had the outcome was fine for me, but not for this individual. Anyway, so she got laughed in her lab meeting about it, like, oh, that's silly. You shouldn't even be, why bother? It's just a small population. Well, fast forward 3 years later, and she's discovered the reason for it. It's not nerves or nervousness. It's a hormone called GDF15, something like that. And so now, and there are already drugs that we have that can target that. Obviously it has to be determined that's safe during pregnancy and things like that. But it for some individuals, they lose the fetus because of the nausea and vomiting. It's a serious disorder when you've got it bad and your whole quality of life is gone. So it's an important thing to study. The other one is brexanolone. So this was discovered it was actually preclinical work so that just means usually mice or rats or some kind of animal model system. As somebody studying mice in the postpartum and discovering that there was this huge drop in a hormone called allopregnanolone. And so, could you look at allopregnanolone and see, could that offset some of the depressive-like states that are observed? And again, fast forward, say 5 to 10 years, and the first time the federal FDA approved a drug for postpartum depression was for brexanolone.
Right.
It works really, really well. And so those are success stories from people studying specific questions around what I call women's health in general.
Yeah. It strikes me that's a complaint that I hear a lot. I hear it a lot from my wife too, having a hard time with menopause right now. And how have they not studied menopause more than they have?
Yeah.
Right?
I'm happy. I'll talk about that too. It's 0.5% of all studies in neuroscience in the field of just brain health in general are on menopause. 0.5%. Physicians get about an hour, maybe a morning in their training on menopause. And we're sent, sorry, this is also a soapbox. We are sent, because I'm experiencing it myself, to gynecologists. And I'm not blaming gynecologists. I'm not blaming our healthcare practitioners because they get so little training in it. So we're sent to the specialists, and only 38% of the gynecologist specialist programs in the US, we don't have the data in Canada yet, actually had any kind of information on menopause. So 60 something percent are not even getting any for the specialists we're supposed to be going to.
Right.
So so we have to become our own specialists but we need informed research, evidence-based information. So we know what we can do to offset our symptoms and whether, and again, and not what we just, a paper's going to come out with Laura Gravelson, who's one of my postdocs, and it's called One Size Does Not Fit All, because there are many hormone therapies and there are many menopauses, and we have to determine which one fits for us. But yeah, we have so little research, it's hard to put together the pieces of the puzzle.
Right. And it's sort of an amazing thing. We were earlier this month, we were talking about, working with older people and how little people are interested in doing the research.
Yeah, exactly. Also true.
Yeah. And I thought, the question I had there is, well, all of us plan to become older, right? At some point, wouldn't we want to
I know
research to help us when we do? And same thing with this. Menopause is going to happen to 50% of the population.
Yeah.
How are we not paying more?
And it's going to happen.
Right.
I know I'm immortal, but it's still going to happen to me.
Yes.
But again, I'm not the only one, because I complained about this on when it was called Twitter, that I kept when I write grants about these things, I'm told to add males, which I find a tiny bit offensive.
Yeah.
Not that I don't think it's important to study, and we do. A significant part of my lab also looks at males and the differences between males and females, or men and women, and we also have some work on sexual orientation and how that influences health as well. So it's not that I don't think it's important, but we don't always need that. And pardon my phrasing, but we don't always need that male standard, right? We don't need the standard males, because you can have a premenopausal woman and a postmenopausal woman of the same age, and we can study what differences might there be in terms of anything to do with the brain. I mean, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm going to always go to there. Well, right. But, or, even like whatever, the neurochemistry or how your vitamin load, right? Like what differences are there so that we can inform people, hey, this has gone down and you might want to consider. And some people say, well, why are you pathologizing? By studying menopause, we're pathologizing it. I find that a really interesting comment because we study cancer.
Right.
We study allergic reactions. These are all natural things and we study them. We're not pathologizing them. I think it's really important for us to, yes, it's a natural part of aging, but so are a lot of things, including cancer, including the increased risk for dementia. But we want to thrive when we're aging. Most of us would like to thrive, not languish, right? So
Right.
we want to live the best way we possibly can. And so it's really important to study menopause and all the characteristics around there, 100%. But yeah, it's just such a tiny percentage. So 0.5%. I know I'm giving you really tiny numbers, but that's of all time. That's of all time, not just
Yeah,
in 1 year. And yes, there's probably more, but we have so much time to make up for it.
for sure. Now, I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit about the work that you do, right? You're saying in your lab that sometimes, yes, you involve men in some of these things, and you're looking
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
differences that sexual orientation makes. What is some of the work that you're doing right now? What's happening in your lab?
It's a very dangerous question because we love to talk about all of this. So my lab, I would just say broadly studies how hormones and specifically estrogens and sometimes androgens, sometimes stress hormones influence the brain, and our sort of focus is on stress-related psychiatric disorders, mostly depression, as well as Alzheimer's disease. So we study how, yes, sex plays a role, how estrogens might play a role. So we look at menopausal hormone therapy. We look at a little bit of hormonal contraceptives and how that might have a long-term influence on the brain.
Okay.
Large part of our work has also been looking at pregnancy. So we look how pregnancy affects the brain. We started this in like 2000. So how pregnancy affects the brain, not only in the short term, where a lot of people have, not a lot of, but people have looked, but also long term. So what happens in middle age, and does that impact our aging at all? And too long didn't read. It does.
I'm wondering if you can tell me how. Like, what is the causal link there?
The causal link is harder to tell you, but again, because I'm a neuroendocrinologist, I'm going to say it's going to be hormones. I don't think that's a huge leap there, but we have done studies where we've looked at, again, in animal models where we get an animal pregnant, but we also have foster moms. So it'll be an animal that's never been pregnant. Then we give them experience with pups and then they'll do all the same kind of maternal behaviors except lactating, except, the milk letdown.
Right.
And I can tell you the brains look very different. So there is something specific about pregnancy that causes some of these changes. So it's not in animals. It's not just the experience of mothering, if you will, or these maternal behaviors, as they're called. There's something about pregnancy specifically. So we actually see, I focus a lot on this area called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really important for memory and emotion.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first areas that shows integrity loss with both of those disorders. It's a disorder I care about the most. Right. Has a lot of hormone receptors, has a lot of stress hormone receptors there, a lot of estrogen receptors. And so that particular area really decreased there's shows a lot of plasticity, and plasticity we study is the birth of these new brain cells. So there's a lot of these new brain cells that can generate and get integrated in the circuit. And during pregnancy and then the postpartum and pretty late, like well after the pups have left the nest,
right.
Rats and mice, it's kind of nice. The pups leave the nest like within a month. That doesn't happen to us humans.
Not so much, yes.
Not so much. But we still see this reduction in what we call neurogenesis. Now people are going to say, well, that's mommy brain, right? Forgetfulness. But no, actually, it's not related to that. And in fact, if anything, in rodents, after the pups have left the nest, the moms are much better at learning mazes. So they actually have better cognitive
Oh, wow.
They do have reduced during pregnancy, like in the third trimester and in the early postpartum, which is kind of akin to what you might see for certain forms of learning and memory in humans. But what happens I kind of think about it as when the kids are old enough to not wake you up and get their own cereal and turn on the TV. So, you
Right.
know, you can have a little bit of more of a sleep.
Yes,
Um,
that's always a pleasant time and a
it's
pleasant
such a good
information.
time.
Yes.
It's such a good time. You can relax a little more because you know they're not going to I don't know, launch themselves off a table or something and hurt themselves. That's a good time. Anyway, that's when we see in animal models that memory really improves. And then what we see in middle age is that this neurogenesis that's been suppressed actually really increases. So there's a lot more of it. And the same kinds of signatures are seen in humans as well. That's the
Okay.
work of somebody named Anne-Marie DeLange, another woman in science. She's in Switzerland. And she's seen like signatures of less brain aging in humans with previous pregnancies. It's really interesting. I mean, I find it
That is
fascinating.
super interesting. Plasticity. I'm specifically interested in this because the previous one that we did was with Jessica Strong at the University of PEI. She's a geropsychologist who works with what she calls cognitive reserve. And we made the
Yeah.
distinction between that and neuroplasticity. I'm still trying to, sort of
Yeah.
reconcile the two things and whether it's, how they're related. So I'm hoping you can give me a short overview of plasticity and what we're talking about there.
Yeah, plasticity I can. Cognitive reserve also confuses me, to be honest. Even though I've had people explain it to me a few times, it could just be my old brain and the lack of plasticity. Um,
Well,
but
in her case, we were talking about the famous nun study, right? I'm sure you're familiar with maybe.
I am, but it's such a long time ago. I don't even, it's like they were, if they had more education, I'm not really sure. Remind me
But
again.
it was just people who were in a convent, nuns who were in a
Yeah.
convent for
They said they
years
had
and
a
years and
very,
years.
very similar environment, but
Right.
yeah,
And then they studied their brains at the end of their
yeah,
lives
yeah,
when they died. And some of them were riddled with tau or
yeah.
looked
Amyloid beta,
like they should have had advanced
yeah,
Alzheimer's or what have
yeah.
you, but they never did show any of the symptoms of it. And they think that's because they were constantly reading and constantly working and
Yeah,
doing, mental things. And
yeah,
that,
yeah,
and her distinction there was that the cognitive reserve they had built up over so long by
hmm
doing all of this intellectual
yeah.
work
Helped.
basically created a buffer
Yeah,
for their brain so that
yeah,
the dementia didn't take hold the way that it would in somebody else. And
yeah.
I had always thought of that as a neuroplasticity study, but it may well be cognitive reserve, which is something a little different.
I mean, I think it is and it isn't. What are the mechanisms of cognitive reserve, and one of them might be through neuroplasticity. But one thing that's really interesting, because this is something I also sort of study, is because we look at Alzheimer's risk, and we use so the top three non-mod, and this is not what you're asking me, but the top three non-modifiable factors for late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease, and like 80% of Alzheimer's disease or 90% of Alzheimer's disease is that our advancing age. So the older you are, the more likely being female,
Right.
and having possession of one or two of these ApoE4 alleles. So two-thirds of Alzheimer's patients are female, and 60% of Alzheimer's patients have one or two of these ApoE4 alleles. So it's a really big risk factor. Yeah, it's hardly studied, which is also really interesting.
Right.
But it turns out that, so, it's interesting because it was a nun. So, of course, they're going to be all female,
Right.
probably. And what we and others have shown is that even in the face of more amyloid, so one of those neuropathological features of Alzheimer's disease, females show more neuroplasticity, and obviously they're saying, oh, better cognition, better memory in humans, and we also see that in other models as well. Some work of Jessica Caldwell. I just put this on LinkedIn, so if you want to look at like an explanation of what I'm saying. I think I did an okay job there. But so we see a very different neuroplastic profile of the females than we do in the males. So the males show the what you think of as the normal effect, more amyloid, reduced plasticity, and the females actually show the opposite. They show more amyloid and actually increased plasticity. Um,
Okay.
So plasticity is sort of an umbrella term for like how the brain can adapt. And the brain can adapt in many ways. People will often talk about synaptic plasticity. So the way that cells communicate, brain cells communicate is through synapses. And so they're usually talking about like more or less of these synapses. The plasticity we study is the birth of those new brain cells. So even though you're probably told that your brain, you get a bunch of these brain cells and then they just die off as we age, there is one region of the brain in particular that retains the ability to produce these new brain cells throughout life. And so that was super fascinating to me when I was a young student. I was like, ooh, that's so cool. I want to study it.
Yeah.
And so that's what we do in the lab. That's one of the things that we do in the lab. But it's really important to understand that just because there's more of these doesn't mean it might be contributing to the circuit well, right? They might not be integrated properly. So if you could have lots of them, like more is,
Right.
is that excess is best? No, that's a bad one. That's a bad analogy. More isn't always better, right? So just because you have a lot of these cells, if they're not making appropriate connections, they could be messing up communication. They could be messing up the circuit. And so that's one thing just to keep in mind. So we'd want to make sure that if we were doing a therapy that would increase these new cells, that they were actually acting in the way we want them to act. They were going to where we wanted them to go to. So plasticity is kind of a funny thing because people will, it's like the way the brain changes. And the idea would be that you'd want to always maintain the ability to change your brain to change, right? The
Right.
less and less plasticity you have, the more rigid you'd be in terms of how you could adapt.
And you said earlier that in the experiments with animals, as they go through pregnancy,
Yeah.
that their
Yeah.
the stimulation of new brain cells starts to happen soon after, right? That they end up having a greater
Yeah.
ability to solve them. Than
It's in middle age. So I wouldn't say soon after, it's quite a bit after, but they get better in terms of their learning and memory. And just incidentally, people have looked at brain volume changes across time, like within all these different brain areas. So they're just starting to look at this too with human pregnancies, and the very similar things are being seen. So you see this reduction in a lot of what we call gray matter, which are just brain cells during pregnancy, and that extends at least 6 years. It's not related to like lack of memory. You can sort of think of your brain as becoming more efficient. Like if there's too
right?
much noise there, sometimes it's not a good thing.
Yeah. And
So
I'm just wondering if the fact that women tend to exhibit more plasticity than
yeah,
men is
yeah.
because they are far more likely than men to have been pregnant at some point.
It's very possible. That's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting question. I can't tell you the answer to that because I don't know, but it is very possible. I mean, I would say that anytime you see these like sort of hormonal fluctuations, that is generally associated with some form of plasticity. And I guess it's not that men don't have hormones. In fact, you guys have a diurnal fluctuation in terms of your testosterone levels. So they're high in the morning and then they decrease by this. So I make a standard joke of, people always talk about women being hormonal, but we have a 30-day cycle. You guys have a daily cycle of hormones. So who's
Right.
more hormonal, right? Right. Um, and the testosterone levels actually decrease by about 50% across the day. So it's not like a small percentage of decrease. But yeah, it's an interesting question. Is it because of these sort of hormonal events? And I don't think anyone really has the answer to that. It's hard to compare them, right? Too, because
Right.
they're
Yes.
different.
I imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk about the NIH a little bit and the situation that we find ourselves in now. I think a lot of people are thinking of it as just an American thing. Okay, we're shutting down American science for the time being, but how does that affect you and the work that you're doing? How does that affect your colleagues and, the atmosphere right now? And just for a little context, last year we did our theme for Psychology Month was climate change.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I spoke with a scientist at McMaster who was talking about the sort of chilling effect that previous government policies had on science in Canada, which was specifically in the realm of climate change. All right. The government had basically said, you're not allowed to talk to the media. You're not allowed to do this kind of study. And they tried to shut it down. And even after that government moved out and a new government that was presumably more receptive to science moved in, the chilling effect remained, and people were still afraid to even apply for funding for research in the area of climate change because that structure was in place. And while that's getting marginally better, now we have this, massive earthquake that's happening in the community. So I'm wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about how that's affecting everybody.
I mean, there's been seismic shifts, just to keep on to the earthquake theme there, in terms of what's happening to science to the south of us. And I think we're just at the beginning of what's going on there. But there's this idea that is woke science, right? To look at any kind of diversity in science. So some of the buzz phrases for NSF, which is, I think, National Science Foundation, are to remove grants that mention bias and diversity, but also female and women, not male and men.
Right.
Women, and also trans and gender diverse. There are lots of disciplines that use bias and diversity, and they don't mean what the Trump administration wants. Right. So those terms are used in physics and chemistry all the time.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of things being shut down because they just have a word in there that they Google searched or whatever.
And also like the gut microbiome, which I'm sure will be, have heard of, which is, one of the measures is the diversity of alpha diversity, beta diversity, which I'm not a gut microbiome specialist, so I don't remember. But it's like the bacteria, that are living in there, and the diversity of it. And the more diversity, the better health outcomes we have. But that has nothing to do with DEI.
Right.
So people are really concerned. I mean, pulling the idea of, we don't need to study women's health because there's been such a focus on it recently, and now we can move back to just studying. I just don't even somebody said to me, don't worry about it, just put people in your grants from now on. But actually, pregnant people is also not allowed in grants anymore. And so you can't use that term. I can't use women. So I guess I just say pregnant individuals. Like I don't. And I'm not sure really what scientists, we don't have good success rates with our grants, right? It's about like 10 to 15%. When we put in a grant, that's the chance of our success, right? It's better than a lottery, but marginally. But we keep going because we care a lot about our science, and often the reviews we get back are good feedback, and we change our grant a little bit, and then we put it back in, and then we hopefully eventually get the money we want to do the work we want to do. So we're very good at that. Somehow they think that it just, tagging these words will stop this woke nonsense. But it certainly won't. It's studying sex and gender and women's health related variables is going to improve health for all. And I'll give you an example of this. And there's a few of them, but I'm going to give you lazeroids. So lazeroids were a drug that was discovered because they were named after Lazarus, risen from the dead.
From the dead, yes.
And it was for stroke recovery. So it was people that had suffered a stroke. It really worked miracles. And of course, it was discovered preclinically first in mice and rats. And so it went all the way to clinical trials. So that's our gold standard. You have a placebo group, and then nobody knows, and you're double blinded whether you get it or not. But it turns out that all of the preclinical work, or most of it, was done in males. And the early clinical trial was all done in men. They're more likely earlier to suffer from a stroke anyway. Later on, it's women. And it failed phase 3 clinical trials. So the drug is no longer on the market. It put the drug company out of business because they're very expensive to run these trials. But when secondary analyses, when people looked at the data, it works in men.
Right.
To raise them from the dead, literally.
Yeah.
It didn't work in women. It might have made things worse. So for women, that's a drug that's now not on the market that would help men's health.
Right.
That's why it's so important to study these things, because that's what personalized precision medicine to me is what it's all about. Like if we find a drug that is really good for white men, that's great. But
Right.
let's
Yeah.
also find it for Black women or trans individuals. And it's not going to be the same one for trans individuals because it's so different in terms of
Mhm.
who they are and maybe their journey, their hormonal journey as well. So, but all of this will help. Studying this and paying attention to this will help us understand. Even Tylenol, for example, only works in 40% of the people.
Right.
So, who does it work better for? And maybe why, and what might work better for the 60% of individuals, you know,
Yeah.
that's, and probably sex plays a role.
Yeah, it probably does in most things. So that brings me back to Women Mind. What is your specific role with Women Mind? What do you do as part of that organization? And, what are some of the outcomes that you hope to achieve through it?
So, yeah, I think I told you the objectives already: raising the awareness, promoting women plus scientists at CAMH, and advancing women's health research. So we're coming to the end of our 5-year term. So I'm the scientific lead of Women Mind. And then there are really great people behind it. One in particular named Jenna Roy and Tiara Home, who run the program. So we have a mentorship program that's I think something like 60% of all women scientists have been through the mentorship program, and it works on a hub.
60% of all women
Yeah.
scientists in Canada have been through the
No, in
mentorship.
CAMH at
Oh,
CAMH.
at CAMH. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. But we're hoping to create a model for other institutions to use this because we've had really great success rates. It's like 100% of the individuals, which is hard to believe, but really appreciated the program and want it to continue. So it's a hub model. So it's not so a lot of mentorship programs they'll put you one-on-one with somebody, but
Right.
that can work. But if you don't see eye to eye with your mentor, it doesn't always work very well. So this is meant as it's a group of people that get together every month and bring up certain issues and work through the problems together. That's one angle, and the other is that we have two scientists. I'm one of them, and another one named Daisy Singla, and we do the important work in the areas that we're interested in. So Daisy Singla's work is firmly in perinatal mental health.
Okay.
So, pregnancy and the postpartum. And she's a clinical psychologist. And then we're right in the middle of hiring a third scientist. I'm hoping we get to hire some more scientists. And then we also offer postdoc awards. So this is people who have finished their PhD and they want to intern in somebody's lab, but they have to have a focus on women's mental health. It doesn't have to be women's mental health. It could be looking at sex and gender. It could be gender diverse health too, but something with a focus on these kinds of variables. So we have put out, I think, 18 of those awards. And also we give seed grant funding. So people that usually haven't done this kind of work before, but might have seen something in their data or might have a question they're really interested in. And we give out, they have to write a grant. And if it's good enough, they'll get awarded this grant to do research in women's mental health. So those are
Okay.
sort of the things we do in a nutshell. And it's a fantastic community. You can join Women Mind if you want. Please reach out. There's a website, and we're always happy to take new members. And there's another thing I run called the Women's Health Research Cluster. That's also trying to do the good work as well, more on terms of knowledge translation. And feel free to. There's lots of information from Women Mind and the cluster, and there's some initiatives that we do together as well. We just held an event in Toronto called Galentine's, which was Love Your Day. Galentine's, I'm sure it's from something else in Parks and Rec, but that's the first time I heard about it. It was the show called Parks and Rec.
I think it is Parks and Rec. Yes, I think I remember that episode.
We watch the same kind of TV, obviously.
We obviously do.
And it was about girls and women and anyone that identified as such, and loving your brains through puberty, all those hormonal transitions, puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. And we sold out within 48 hours. We didn't charge any money for it. But I believe it's available on YouTube, which is a bit embarrassing because I say a few things, forgetting that it was going to be posted, but whatever, it's fine.
Well, I will find it and either put it in the notes or not, but I will put the Women Mind in the notes too. So anyone
Perfect.
who wants to participate and join up can absolutely do so. I am cognizant that I'm taking up more of your time than I promised. So one last question.
Sure.
Which is just, how did you get into this in the first place? Like, what got you into science when you were younger, and what led you on the career path that you currently?
That's also a long answer.
I'm sure
There were a few detours along the way, but I guess I've always been fascinated because I grew up in a time when I went to school, I had to wear a skirt. Can you believe that? Can you believe that people alive today that had to wear a skirt because I was a girl? We were required to wear a skirt. Eventually it changed. It wasn't that long that I had to, but my parents, I'm so grateful for them because they were obviously from a different era, but they were like, you're smart. You can do whatever you want to do, except maybe become Pope, maybe. But other than that,
Pope was out for me early on too.
So it's okay.
Like, I'm the right gender for Pope, but
but not otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was just fascinated by this. I think being told like I was different because I was a girl. I think that really instead of being enraged by it, I was curious why I was told this, or curious why there were. And then when I started to do university, I really got interested in the area of female brains and male brains, and and I noticed very early on like there's hardly any information, and I wanted to learn if there was any kind of differences in what that might mean for our health. And so it was a bit of I started in engineering first.
Oh, yeah.
And then took a psychology as an elective, Psychology 101. It was Susan Lederman. Still remember because she started the lecture, and she's a perception. She works in perception.
Okay.
And she said, and remember, I'm in engineering, so I'm taking all these physics, and I loved it.
Yeah.
But she said, I'm the first Canadian, the first woman, and the first psychologist to ever be asked on a NASA panel. And she was asked because the astronauts were complaining they couldn't feel things through their gloves.
Okay.
And when they went out on spacewalks, like if you're fixing, right? Because then you want to take off the gloves, but in space you can't do that.
Yeah.
You can feel things more. And I was hooked. I was like, that's so interesting. I want to learn that. I want to be invited on a NASA panel too, and I want to do it. Of course, that's not at all what I ended up doing, but I ended up taking more psychology, and as a result, I'm always going to do it.
Thanks, Dr. Galea, for taking the time to speak with me today and for continuing to always study women's brains. And thanks to the funding agencies, the scientific community, and the policymakers who prioritize this research to enable Dr. Galea and her colleagues to continue to do it. And thanks to you for listening, streaming, downloading, and reviewing today's episode. Links to Women Mind and the Women's Research Health Cluster are in the show notes, so if you like, you can get further involved. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer and editor is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.